Chapter 9. The Urbanization of America. So during the late 1800s and early 1900s, American cities had been experiencing extraordinary growth. A few cities grew to become some of the largest in the world. New York's population, which was already more than 1 million in 1860, was at 4.7 million by 1910. Philadelphia went from nearly 500,000 to 1 million people in the same period. Chicago rose from 100,000 to more than 2 million. Although at the end of the century it was still true that more Americans lived in rural areas than cities, twice as many in fact, no one could doubt where the future led. The United States was fast becoming a nation of city dwellers. It was no coincidence that this remarkable urban growth occurred when railroad companies were creating a web of tracks across the land. The growth of the railroads was turning many small towns into bustling cities. Kansas City, Missouri was a small town, but it grew to be a large town because several railroad companies decided to build their main lines through the city. This invented new industries in the city. Flour mills, meatpacking plants became big industries because they were able to ship out through the railroad tracks. Along with railroads helping to build cities, manufacturing was also impacting the city's growth. Manufacturing contributed to the growth of the cities in the second half of the 1800s. Factories that were water-powered would need to be built near rivers and streams. But by the 1840s and 1850s, manufacturing began to switch to steam engines, which meant that they did not need to be built near streams or rivers and could be built anywhere. By the 1900s, in the early years, there were about 30 million people living in American cities. One source of these new people was America's countryside. About 11 million Americans had left farming jobs and moved to the city. Many farmers had lost their farms or were in debt and could not pay them back because there was just not enough money made in farming. Many decided that they would rather work in the cities and work in factories than continue to work on lands that were not making any money. Cities seemed like places of opportunity. There were schools and libraries that offered the chance for education and new careers. Another source of new people moving to cities was through immigration. A lot of immigration was still happening from Europe, as well as African American workers who had been freed after the war. As these American cities continued to grow, they would spread both upward and outward. Buildings became cheaper to build, and they were cheaper to build up rather than out because the land was so expensive. However, there were some new problems with building buildings taller. And what they discovered was that by building a steel skeleton to carry the weight of the building and then just making walls to cover it, they could make higher buildings. In 1885, William LeBaron Jenney completed a 10-story building for an insurance company in Chicago. At the same time, they also had the invention of the electric elevator. And using these two new ideas together, a unique American invention began, the skyscraper. At about the same time, cities also began to spread outward. Before the Civil War, most American cities had been called walking cities. That means you could walk pretty much anywhere in the city on foot. Most cities were only about 2 miles from the center and did only take about half an hour to get from one side to the other. The factories, the warehouses, the shops, everyone all lived together. When the population of a walking city increased, people just seemed to crowd into the same space. However, some changes in transportation began to change what American cities looked like. At first, there were horse-drawn street railways or horse cars that made their appearance in the mid-1800s. These horse cars could carry people about twice as fast as they could walk, which meant that people could live 3 or 4 miles away from work and still get there within that same half an hour. Starting in the 1880s, there were several new forms of transportation that also changed the shape of American cities. There was the electric street railway, or trolley car, in Virginia. In New York, they built elevated railroads. These were called Ls, rode on tracks high above the city. They were supported by steel posts. Underground railroads also started to pop up. These were called subways. America's first subway opened in Boston in 1897. What happened with the new transportation that came was unusual, because what it meant was that the wealthy could move further away from the middle of the city. Those who could afford new housing would move out further in the city, move into nicer areas, and then use transportation to get to the city center for their jobs. This meant a separation of the wealthy from the poor, and it would be one of the continuing and growing problems of the American city.